Welcome back to our daily Rambam class. We are up to the laws of Shar, Avos, chapter 9, the laws of other forms of impurity, chapter 9. It's Thursday. Let us begin with a quick look at where we are up to in the Rambam. We are learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah and onto the 10th volume, the book of Sefer Torah, the book of purity, which is the largest of them all with 144 chapters, a total of 8 topics. Let's take a look at those 8 topics. We learned about impurity of the dead, Tumas Meis, Paraduma, about Saras, Mishka Vabaishav, impurity of places one dies on Susan, people that or sources of a more serious form of impurity. We learned, and now we are learning about Shar, Avos, other sources of Tumah. This is kind of a collection of different sources of impurity. And then we'll learn about foods imparting impurity, vessels or receiving impurity, vessels, and finally the laws of mikvahs. For today, we are on to chapter 9 of Shar, Avos. This is the way the Rambam breaks it down. He's got in the 10th book of Torah, Sefer Torah, he has 8 topics, and the 5th topic of the 8 is Shar Avos, other sources of Tumah. And then I've just broken it down a little bit more using this Rambam over here into the different forms of impurity that are discussed in this section of Shar Avos. So the Rambam just has a total of 20 chapters, but just to fill you in at where we're at, so the first 3 chapters dealt with animal carcasses, and then we learned about insects, and then seed, and then idols, food and drinks. And as of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we're learning about impurities that were instituted by the sages, which means that by Torah law, there would be no source of impurity at all. But the rabbis actually instituted that certain things cause impurity, each for their own reasons. And today we're going to look at some of those things that the rabbis enacted, decreed to be impure, and we'll look at why the rabbis did exactly that. Let's take a look. Shar Avos, chapter 9. A person who immerses his head and the majority of his body in drawn water, so that would be like in a bath, or 3 lugim of drawn water fall on his head, that would be something like a shower, and the majority of his body. He is a secondary derivative of impurity until he immerses in a mikveh, which means that he becomes impure, but not like the highest level of impurity, a lower level of impurity, shady l'tumah, as if he had touched something impure. He didn't touch anything impure, but the rabbis consider him to be the level of impurity of somebody that touched something impure, or secondary, I should say. It's not so, that means itself fine-tuning what it means exactly secondary. But the point of the matter is that the rabbi said that somebody who went into a 3 lugim, which I think is approximately a liter. Now let me think this through. The revius is 86 mil, and the revius haloig. Revius is a quarter of a loig. So that means that 1 loig is 4 times 86 mil. So that is approximately 400 mil. minus 15, 30, 60, about 350 mil. Yeah, 350 mil is in a lug. So 3 lugin is approximately a liter. A person who goes into a liter of drawn water or has a liter of drawn water fall on his head becomes impure. And if he touches foods, he causes them to be considered as a tertiary derivative. So they become one step removed, but they also become impure. If he touches liquids, he imparts impurity to them, causing them to be considered as a primary derivative, and they impart impurity to other foods and liquids. They do not, however, impart impurity to kalim, to utensils, to vessels. Now, why did the sages decree that such a person should be impure? This is what happens. Here's an interesting piece of history. People would go to mikveh in caves where the water was foul. I'm just thinking, why would they go to mikvahs in caves? Probably because they need to, because they wanted to be modest. They don't want to go into the natural body of water in the public eye. So they would go instead into a cave, or maybe caves. Maybe it was easier to find natural fresh water in caves, like springs. Maybe it was common to find springs in caves. I'm not sure. But that's, at least the simple explanation is because out of modesty, they would go in caves. Now, sometimes the water in those caves was already was foul. It was dirty water. And then they would wash with fresh water drawn for the sake of cleanliness. Okay. So why didn't they just use the fresh water to start with? Very simple, because the fresh water needed to be drawn. It needed to be, let's say, drawn out of the well. I guess we can kind of think of it like this. If you want fresh water, so you have a well. So you dig a hole and you access the water. So to go down a deep hole is not really an option. That's dangerous. Instead, you send the bucket down with a chain and you pull it up. But once you do that, then that water is no longer qualifies for mikveh, as we'll learn. So to go down into the well would be is not an option. That's for buckets. It's not for people. As opposed to caves, I guess caves often have like different paths that you go down until you reach the water. So I think it was not just out of modesty. It could be that that's where they were able to find an easier way to access natural bodies of water. Maybe not, because if it was completely natural, it wouldn't be so foul. It would be fresher. Anyhow, the clean water, the fresh water, was drawn. It did not qualify for mikveh. As opposed to the well water, as the natural water, the mikveh water was not clean. And so people would first go to mikveh, and then they would wash themselves with fresh water. Anything wrong with that? Not at all. But what followed became the problem. This became such a widespread practice that the majority of people got the impression that the drawn water in which the people would ultimately wash was the agents that conveyed ritual purity, tara, and not the immersion in the waters of the mikveh. So people started thinking that going to mikveh is actually a hygienic thing. They didn't realize it's an entirely spiritual thing. And they actually thought that as long as they give themselves a good wash with fresh water, then they've become pure. Or they thought that using the drawn water to wash themselves was actually able to achieve that ritual purity. And they stopped going into the smelly waters altogether. I remember when I was in yeshiva, there was a particular student that was having a bit of a rebellion. And there were showers in the dormitory. and then their showers in the mikveh. Obviously, we're talking about a men's mikveh because Hasidic men go to mikveh every morning. But the showers in the mikveh were better showers than the showers in the dormitory. So this particular student used to go all the way to the mikveh just to use the shower, but he wouldn't chas v'shalom actually go into the mikveh because he was having a bit of rebellion. So he didn't want to do anything religious. So he used to come all the way to the mikveh just to get a better shower. So back in the day, it wasn't out of rebellion, but it reached a point where people actually were going to mikveh without going to mikveh. They were going to the shower after the mikveh without actually going into the mikveh itself. Therefore, they would immerse themselves carelessly without attention to details. Okay, he doesn't say that they didn't go to mikveh at all. It's just that they would, I guess, kind of jump in, jump out without ensuring that they were maybe properly submerged. If even one hair of a person's body, if a person has long hair and a little bit of their hair doesn't go into the water, then he has not gone to mikveh, because the whole idea of mikveh is that the person is entirely submerged in the water. So people started going more carelessly, without attention to details. Accordingly, our sages decreed that when a person immerses his head and the majority of his body in drawn water, or 3 lugim of drawn water fall on his head and the majority of his body, he actually becomes a secondary derivative of impurity. He actually becomes impure. So they actually needed to stop the freshwater washing for some time after mikveh to ensure that people were actually realizing that it's the mikveh itself that brings them purity. Even when 3 lugim of drawn water falls on the head of the majority of the body of a person who was pure, so it's not just that somebody who was going to gain purity who was in a state of impurity, even if he was pure, or he immerses his head and the majority of his body in drawn water, he becomes a secondary derivative of impurity until he immerses himself. I think even nowadays, practically speaking, when a person is required to go to mikveh, it is suggested not to shower or bathe immediately after mikveh, unless there is a particular need for that. But maybe that's just because a person wants to have the special mikveh waters, which is very special, remain with them, or maybe it has to do with this particular law that we're learning. After a person who contracted impurity in such a manner immerses himself, once he actually goes to the mikveh, he need not wait until nightfall to regain purity, for the impurity contracted by this person is fundamentally a rabbinic decree. So usually when a person goes to mikveh, they need to wait till sunset. Not so by this form of impurity, since it was rabbinic, the moment the person goes into mikveh is clear. So that what that means practically is the person would be able to make himself impure by showering or bathing first, and then once he goes to mikveh, he will be pure. Similarly, a person who contracted impurity because he ate impure foods or drank impure liquids and then immersed himself need not wait until nightfall to regain purity, because that too is rabbinic. Similarly, when vessels, kalim, utensils, become impure due to contact with impure liquids, once they were immersed, they become pure. There's no need to wait until nightfall, because these impurities are fundamentally rabbinic decrees. So now let's talk for the next few halachas more about these 3 lugim, this approximately liter of drawn water, which can make a person impure. The following laws apply when 3 lugim of drawn water fell on a person from 2 or 3 different containers. So 1 lug, like I guess 3 like small Coke bottles. Each bottle is about 350 ml. So you had 1. I guess you don't need to say Coke bottles. Well, he had 3 bottles of Velpra natural spring water, 3 bottles of Velpra water, 3 small bottles poured onto him. Not 1.5 liter bottle, because that's already shloisha lugim, but he had 3 smaller drinking bottles, like you'd pick up at a petrol station. If water began to flow from the second before it concluded from the first, then they can be combined to reach the sum of 3 lugim. Meaning if the second water started pouring on him before the first finished, he's having a shower over here with milk plus spring water, 330 ml bottles. If the second started before the first finished, then if water falls from, then he does become impure. But if water falls from 4 containers, it is not combined. So if these 3 lugim were scattered in not just in maybe, I don't know, 150 ml bottles, so then that wouldn't make him impure. It has to be a max of 3 bottles. If it's more than 3 bottles, then it's already considered distinct. It's not considered one pouring. Even if one began to flow before the other ceased flowing, he is pure. If the water fell on his head, but not on the majority of his body, or it fell on the majority of his body, but not on his head, or it fell on his head from above and on the majority of his body from below or from the side, he is impure. He is pure. To impart impurity, the water must fall on his head and the majority of his body that is close to his head in an ordinary manner. Similarly, if his head entered drawn water, but not his body, or his body entered, but not his head. So until now we spoke about the shower, if it came on him. Similarly, if he went into it, if it was only his head but not his body, or only his body but not his head, or his head was inserted in drawn water and then other drawn water engulfed his body from the side or from below, from 2 different directions, again, he is pure. To contract impurity, his head and the majority of his body close to his head must enter the water in an ordinary manner. But a portion of a person's head, not the whole head, just a portion of it, and half the majority of his body were inserted in drawn water. So that was going into the water, in the body of water, and drawn water falls now to the shower on the other half of his head and the other half of the majority of his body. Since water fell on half and water was and half was inserted in water, he is pure. Again, when the Rambam has made a decree, it's limited to the exact decree. Even it's not just based on logic, meaning not just because logically they saw exactly where it applies, but rather they said there's a danger at hand. We need to institute this decree. We're instituting it as follows and limiting it to that. So even in other scenarios that may seem identical, that's fine, because once they make a decree, they limit it to the exact scenario of the decree. But the 3 lugim of water which fell upon a person, or into which he inserted his hand into body, were a combination of drawn water and natural water. So he had water falling on him. Part of it was coming from a waterfall, and part of it was coming from a tap. Or they were mixed with wine, honey, or milk. Again, he is pure. The 3 lugim must be entirely drawn water. The status of these 3 lugim of water which fell on a pure person, on which he inserted his head and body, and for which he contracted impurity, also changes. Since the person became a secondary derivative of impurity, the water is also impure for attached to the secondary derivative. And here we have a famous line of the Rambam. It is as if the waters tell the pure person, hey, I made you impure and you made me impure. The waters themselves are pure, but the way that the waters fell upon the person made him impure. And once they made him impure, he's now impure, so he makes them impure. So they make him impure and he makes them impure. Hatar timeinu oisai v'tib'anu. Initially, they would place, okay, that was that, gentlemen. That was all about one decree of the rabbis, which was that drawn water into which a person dips or has poured on him causes him to become impure. Here's a new enactment of the sages. Initially, they would place loaves of truma next to sacred scrolls, saying, these are holy and these are holy. Imagine you're preparing your Shabbos table and you got your beautiful chalas for Shabbos and you put them aside because you want your Shabbos to be really special. It's already Thursday, believe it or not, it's all the public holidays. And you go and you buy a special challah And then you also had your special, maybe siddur that you use on Shabbos. So you decide you're going to put the two together. You'll have your chalas and your siddur side by side. Well, back in the day, people thought that they had truma, which was holy, and scrolls, which were holy. And they decided to put them side by side. But something awful happened. Mice would come to eat the bread and tear the sacred scrolls. Therefore, the sages decreed that any teruma that touches the holy scriptures would become tameh. It is considered as, again, a tertiary derivative of impurity, as if it touched a secondary derivative. It's actually one down from the previous form of impurity. Again, an enactment by the sages. Thus, all of the holy scriptures disqualify truma like a secondary derivative. So believe it or not, the holy scriptures cause impurity. Why? As a defense mechanism for themselves. Moreover, when anyone whose hands were pure touched one of the holy scriptures, his hands became secondary derivatives of impurity and impart impurity to teruma, to liquids. The rabbis wanted to keep them far apart. Although generally hands only contract impurity from a primary derivative of impurity, as we explained, they contract impurity from a scroll as well by rabbinic law. Tefillin straps, when connected to the tefillin, the blank parchment on the margins above or below the scroll and at the beginning or end when connected to the scroll. A scroll that was erased, but at least 85 letters remained, and a scroll on which at least 85 letters from the Torah are written, as in the passage, and when the ark set forth. All of these impart impurity to hands. Even though it's a blank piece of parchment, it's attached to words of Torah. It's just a strap of the tefillin, it's connected to the tefillin. Not only the words of the Torah, but the words of all of the Holy Scriptures, including the Songs of Songs and Kohelet, which are words of wisdom, impart impurity to hands. There's a big debate in the Talmud whether these sections are indeed part of the holy prophets, since they seem to be more wisdom or love sung. But the conclusion is that they're the holiest of them all. They're part of the prophets, they're part of the writings, and part of the writings, and therefore they too impart impurity. The Aramaic portions of the books of Ezra and Daniel are considered as part of the Holy Scriptures, although it's not even written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic. If by contrast, one translated an Aramaic portion into Hebrew, or a Hebrew portion into Aramaic, or he wrote the Holy Scriptures in the Hebrew script, they do not impart impurity to hands. That applies only when scripture is written in the Ashuri script on parchment with ink. So only when it's an actual parchment with ink written in Ashuris. By the way, the script of the Torah is the holy, the font. The font of the Torah is a holy font. We actually shouldn't use it for any other purposes. You could write a ksuba in it, but if you just wanted a general, you wanted to put your name on your tefillin bag, you wouldn't actually be allowed to use the font of the Torah writing because it's holy. But if it wasn't written in the font of the Torah, then it doesn't have that same level of holiness and therefore does not impart impurity. Although it is forbidden to do so, if one writes Hallel or Mishmach for a child to study, they impart impurity to hands as well. It means obviously ink on parchment in Ashuris, in the Torah font. Although it is forbidden to maintain them, as long as the strings and the straps sewed within the Torah scroll are attached to the scroll, they too impart impurity to the hands. When the case of a scroll, an ark, or the mantle of a scroll are sewn to the scroll itself, if the person were to actually sew the mantle onto the scroll, then they too impart impurity to hands. They're attached. By contrast, although passages of blessings contain the letters of Hashem's name and many Torah concepts, they do not impart impurity to hands. If you just had like a siddur that had a brachas in it, but it wasn't a Torah book, then that does not impart impurity. Again, for sure, a siddur wouldn't impart impurity because it's not ink on parchment and it's not in Ashuris font. But even if you wrote on a scroll blessings, that wouldn't be a problem. Scrolls written by heretics do not impart impurity to hands, since the passage of a Sota is intended to be blotted. So that was that. In fact, the Rambam writes elsewhere that they should actually be destroyed. Since the passage of a Sota is intended to be blotted out, so it's not there to stay, it too does not impart impurity to hands. Ready to test your knowledge? When a person